Let's take a look at process costing in Chapter 4. The specific topic is equivalent full units of production, and we have an assembly line set up to illustrate this topic. And let's take a look at our production for the month of May. There's my assembly line. And when the units roll off the end of that assembly line, they roll into my finished goods inventory. And of course that assembly line consists of my partially completed goods in work in process inventory. I add materials, direct labor, and overhead to the production process to complete my units. So starting on May 1st, the beginning of May, let's place our first unit in production. And there it goes down the assembly line. Let's add a steering wheel to my car, some materials and some direct labor to assemble that, a seat, also more materials and more direct labor for assembly, and now let's add some overhead, some machining. Overhead added, move the auto down the assembly line, and let's add a windshield. And let's start a second unit in production. Add a steering wheel and a seat, both materials and direct labor. And some overhead in the form of machining. And move further down the assembly line. And let's add a hood to the first car and a trunk. And let's add a windshield to that second car. And headlights. A front bumper, tail lights, and a rear bumper, and our first unit is completed. So it rolls off the end of the assembly line and into my finished goods inventory. Now let's add a third unit in production. Now let's fast forward to the end of May, 5 o'clock on May 31st. I shut down my assembly line. I have 2 units that have been completed, rolled off the end of the assembly line, and into finished goods inventory. That 1 unit left on the assembly line is 50% complete. It has half of its materials, half of its direct labor, and half of its factory overhead. 50% complete. So I have 2 questions for you. Question number 1, what was my productive effort during the month of May, given the fact that I completed 2 units and I have 1 unit left on the assembly line, half complete? What was my productive effort? And question number 2, if I spent $32,500 for materials, direct labor, and overhead during the month of May, if that was my total cost, what's my cost per unit? What did it cost me to make one of these cars. So in answer to the first question, I have produced 2.5 units. I have added enough materials, direct labor, and overhead to make 2.5 cars. So if I divide my total cost by my production, $32,500 divided by 2.5, I get an average cost per car for the month of May of $13,000. That's $13,000 per unit. Now let's go from a visual illustration to our spreadsheet and set up a schedule to analyze this information. So let's type in units completed and transferred to finished goods on our first line. And in this example, we had 2 units that rolled off the assembly line and into finished goods. So let's take a look at our work in process, ending inventory. And there are 2 parts to that: number of physical countable units and the percent complete for those physical countable units left on the assembly line at the end of the month. Let's center those and underline them. And for this example, for the month of May, we had 1 unit left on the assembly line at the end of the month in ending work in process inventory, and that unit was 50% complete. Right there, I'm going to multiply those 2 together to get an estimate of the productive effort that went into my ending inventory of finished goods. And of course, it's not 1. Let me add some decimals there. It's 0.5, 50%, half a unit completed. So if I add those 2 together, I get my productive effort for the month of May, and that productive effort is called equivalent full units of production, or just equivalent units of production, 2.5. And that was the denominator in determining my cost per unit. So let's go down here and take a look at cost. I have total cost incurred for the month of May, materials, labor, and overhead of $32,500. And my equivalent full units of production for the month of May, let me right align that and put equivalent full units right there. Don't type it in a second time. Use a formula to reference from above. 2.5 units. So to compute cost per unit, I say 32,500 divided by 2.5 units. And there's my $13,000 in cost per unit. Production cost, total production cost for the month of May. And let me add May to my heading up there. And that's a way to express that visual information analytically in our spreadsheet. Now let's take a look at the month of July. There's my assembly line. On July 1st, I start my first unit in production. I add some materials and labor, a steering wheel, and the labor to assemble, and a seat, and the labor to assemble. And then I add some overhead, machining. And I move that unit down the assembly line. I add 2 more units in production during July, and let's fast forward to the end of the month, where I have completed 1 unit. 1 unit rolled off the end of the assembly line, and for those 2 units left sitting on the assembly line partially completed, that one is 75% complete. It has 75% of its materials, direct labor, and overhead. And that other unit, started late in the month, only has 25% of its materials, direct labor, and overhead. And my first question for you is, on average, what are those 2 units left sitting on the assembly line partially complete? On average, what is their percent of completion for those 2 units? So think about that for a minute. I'm going to say 25% plus 75% divided by 2. That's 100% divided by 2, or 50%. So bringing 2 cars up to 50% completion on average is theoretically enough productive effort, materials, labor, and overhead to complete 1 car. So my productive effort for the month is the equivalent of making 2 cars, that 1 completed and the 2 partially completed units sitting on the assembly line at the end of the month. Now my next question for you is, if we spent $28,000 during the month of July for materials, labor, and overhead, what was the average cost of production per car for that month? So I'm going to say 28,000 divided by my productive effort for the month, which was the equivalent of producing 2 cars, and that gives me an average cost per car of $14,000. Now, instead of graphically, let's take a look at that analytically in our spreadsheet. There's my information from May. Let me copy that structure and paste it right down there. And let's take a look at our July information. So same structure. Let's change that to July. And then let's delete all of this information from May, including those 2 things. And let's enter our July information. 1 unit rolled off the end of the assembly line, and we had 2 units left in ending work in process inventory, and those were on average 50% complete. So let's multiply those 2 together. %50 times 2, and that gives me the equivalent of 1 full unit in those 2 partially completed units on the assembly line, and there's my productive effort for the month of July. Equivalent full units of production, 2. Now let's drop in my total cost, which I think was $28,000, and my equivalent full units of production. Go up there and pick that up. And now let's divide to get our 14,000 cost per unit. Now let's compare that to our previous information. For the month of May, production cost was $13,000 per unit, and for July it's $14,000, a substantial increase. The only way we were able to know that was to, number 1, keep track of our total cost, materials, labor, and overhead incurred during the month, and number 2, keep track of our theoretical productive effort, our equivalent units of production. And that's the way we determine our cost per unit, and we can see if our costs are under control or if they're increasing, as is the case in this example. Now let's take a look at the example in Chapter 4. We're going to use the same structure that we just looked at. We're going to modify it slightly, and we're going to use the information in Exhibit 4-5, which is on page 165 in your text. So let's modify our structure. Let's set up 2 columns, 1 column for materials, and 1 column for direct labor and overhead. So in Exhibit 4-5, there we have our materials, and your authors combine direct labor and overhead in a single category called conversion. Now let's get rid of some of that clutter, and let me center and underline that column heading. And more modifications to my structure. Delete all that information from our previous example. And let me add 1 row here. For ending inventory, I'm going to have a separate row for materials and a separate row for labor and overhead, collectively called conversion. Now in the first line of your author's example up there, Exhibit 4-5, they say units transferred to the next department. I'm going to change that to units transferred to finished goods just to be a little more consistent with our previous example. So on that row right there, units completed and transferred to finished goods, we have 4,800 units that rolled off the end of the assembly line and into finished goods. So for both materials and direct labor and overhead, I'm going to drop in 4,800 units completed and transferred to the next department or to finished goods. Let me get rid of those two decimals right there since we don't need them. And get rid of the clutter. And now let's take a look at ending inventory. There are 400 units in ending inventory, and the materials are 40% complete. Those units have 40% of their materials. So I'm going to drop in on the materials in ending inventory row, units of 400, right there. And those 400 units have on average 40% of their materials. Let's make that a percent. And let's get rid of those underlines. And let's right align that. There we go. And we have 400 units in ending inventory that are 40% complete with respect to their materials. They have on average 40% of their materials. Get rid of the clutter. And now let's take a look at conversion. Those same 400 units in ending inventory have 25%, 1/4 of their labor and overhead. So let me drop that in right there. For conversion, work in process ending inventory, 400 units, 25% of their labor and overhead. Get rid of the clutter. And now let's go over here and multiply across. Those 400 units in ending inventory that have 40% of the materials, theoretically at least, have enough materials to make 160 units start to finish. There are enough materials in those 400 units to make 160 units start to finish. And those same 400 units have 25% of their labor and overhead. That is theoretically enough labor and overhead to make exactly 100 units. So let's total up here. 4,800 units rolled off the end of the assembly line, and there's enough materials sitting on the assembly line in ending work in process to make 160 units. So our equivalent full units of production with respect to materials is 4,960 units. Now let's do the same for labor and overhead. 4,800 units rolled off the end of the assembly line, and we have enough labor and overhead in ending inventory to make 100 units. So the total equivalent full units of production for labor and overhead, or conversion, add those two together, and you get 4,900 units. And let me change that to conversion to be consistent with the book. Notice that the equivalent units of production that we computed in our spreadsheet structure is the same as in Exhibit 4-5, 4,960 for materials and 4,900 for labor and overhead, collectively called conversion. Now let's take a look at exercise 4-2 in your text, and we're going to use that same structure that we just looked at. To compute equivalent units of production. So in exercise 4-2, first of all, we're going to ignore beginning inventory, work in process inventory on October 1st at the beginning of the month. We're going to ignore all that information temporarily. And notice that 410,000 units were completed. 410,000 units rolled off the end of the assembly line, and I'm going to say into finished goods, FG there. So let's drop that information in our structure. 410,000 in both the materials column and the conversion column. And there's that 410,000 down in the exercise there. Let's get rid of all the clutter. And now let's take a look at ending inventory. Work in process October 31st. There are 30,000 units in ending inventory. And let's drop that number in right up there. 30,000 units in ending inventory, both for materials and conversion. And those units have 70% on average of their materials. So let me drop that in right up there for the percent complete with respect to materials. 70% for exercise 4-2. Get rid of some of the clutter there. And the percent complete with respect to conversion is 50%. So let me drop that in right there. Conversion, 30,000 units have on average half of their labor and overhead. 50% complete with respect to labor and overhead. Get rid of that clutter. And now let's take a look at our units completed and transferred to finished goods. 410,000 rolled off the end of the assembly line. And with respect to materials, those 30,000 left in ending inventory had 70% of their materials. That's enough materials to make 21,000 units. So our equivalent full units of production for materials is the sum of those two things, 431,000 units. Now for conversion, labor and overhead. 410,000 units rolled off the end of the assembly line, and for those 30,000 units left in ending inventory, they had half of their labor and overhead. So theoretically, that's enough labor and overhead to make 15,000 units. We can add those two things up to get 425,000 units, equivalent full units with respect to conversion, labor, and overhead. Now we've completed the requirement for exercise 4-2. We've computed equivalent units of production for October, both for materials, 431,000, and for conversion, 425,000. That information there for started in production, we're going to ignore temporarily for right now. So just ignore that started in production. Now this problem, this exercise 4-2, is now available in Connect as a homework assignment. You should complete that assignment in preparation for a quiz in class on Wednesday at the beginning of class over this material.